The crimson light of the setting sun painted long shadows across Copper Canyon's main street, the steady ring of hammer on steel echoing through the desert air. Solomon Reed's weathered hands moved with practiced precision as he shaped the glowing metal before him, each strike deliberate and measured. The old blacksmith's silver-streaked hair caught the dying light as he worked, his leather apron bearing the scars and burns of decades at the forge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Inside his workshop, the walls were lined with tools of his trade, hammers of various sizes, tongs worn smooth from use, and implements whose purposes weren't immediately obvious to the casual observer. But hidden behind those common tools, beneath layers of coal dust and time, lay evidence of a different craft altogether, one that had made him both wealthy and haunted in years past. The rhythmic pounding of his hammer paused as the sound of approaching horses reached his ears. 3 riders appeared through the heat haze, their mounts' hooves kicking up dust that glowed like fire in the evening light. The men were strangers to Copper Canyon, their clothes too fine for common drifters, but too worn for honest businessmen. Solomon noticed how their gun belts sat low on their hips, tied down in the way of men who made their living with quick draws and quicker triggers. "You the smithy?" the leader called out, a tall man with a face scarred by what looked like an old knife wound. His voice carried the sharp edge of someone used to being obeyed. Solomon took his time responding, carefully adjusting the piece of metal he'd been shaping. "That'd be me," he replied, his voice gravelly from years of breathing forge smoke and desert dust. The 3 dismounted spurs jingling against the wooden steps of his shop. Their leader introduced himself as Wade Hawkins, though Solomon doubted that was his real name. The other 2 weren't introduced at all, but their eyes roamed the shop with predatory interest, taking in every detail. "Heard tell you're the only smithy between here and Santa Rosa," Hawkins said, moving closer to inspect a finished horseshoe hanging on the wall. "They say you do good work, clean work." Solomon set his hammer down carefully, noting how the shortest of the 3 men had positioned himself near the door. "Folks say a lot of things," he responded evenly. "What kind of work you looking for?" Hawkins smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Need some special work done. Heard you used to do that kind of thing back in the day, for certain people." The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Solomon's hands remained steady, but his mind raced back through the years, to a time when his forge had turned out more than just horseshoes and plow blades. Back when men would pay in gold for the kind of weapons that could make legends, or end them. "Don't know what you're talking about," Solomon said, turning back to his forge. "I shoe horses, fix wagons, do honest work for honest pay." The 3rd man, who hadn't spoken yet, let out a harsh laugh. "Honest work? What do you call what you did for Blackjack McCullough, or maybe Jake the Snake Martinez?" Solomon's hammer paused mid-strike, the name of Jake Martinez hitting him like a physical blow. There weren't many left alive who knew about those days, about the specialized weapons he'd crafted for the most notorious gunslingers in the territory. Each piece had been a masterwork of steel and silver, balanced perfectly for its owners, and decorated with intricate scrollwork that had become his signature, and each one had gone on to take more lives than he cared to count. "That was a long time ago," Solomon said quietly, setting his hammer down. "I don't do that kind of work anymore." Hawkins moved closer, his boot heels clicking against the wooden floor. "Everything's got a price, old man. Name yours." "Already did," Solomon replied, meeting Hawkins' gaze steadily. "Said I don't do that kind of work anymore. That's my price. Or not doing it at all." The atmosphere in the shop grew tense, the air seeming to thicken with unspoken threats. The man by the door shifted his weight, his hand drifting closer to his gun. "Maybe you need some motivation," Hawkins suggested, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This is a nice shop you got here. It would be a shame if something happened to it. or to that pretty schoolteacher who brings you lunch every day?" Before Solomon could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Everything all right here, Mr. Reed?" Sheriff Thomas Kane stood in the doorway, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. He was young for a lawman, but his eyes held the steady look of someone who'd earned his position the hard way. Hawkins' demeanor changed instantly, a smile spreading across his scarred face. "Just having a friendly chat with the blacksmith here, Sheriff, about some repair work." Kane's hand rested casually near his gun as he studied the three men. "Copper Canyon, a peaceful town, gentlemen. Let's keep it that way." The three men backed away, but Hawkins paused at the door. "We'll be back tomorrow to continue our discussion, Mr. Reed, about that repair work." After they left, Kane turned to Solomon, concern etched on his features. "You all right, old-timer? Those men seemed awfully interested in your smithing." Solomon had already returned to his work, but his strikes were harder now, more forceful. "Nothing I can't handle, Thomas. Been dealing with their kind since before you were born." "I know who they are," Kane said quietly, moving closer to avoid being overheard. "Wade Hawkins and his gang. They've been causing trouble up and down the territory. 3 train robberies in the last month, and those are just the ones we know about. Word is they're planning something big." Solomon nodded, letting the rhythm of his hammer fill the silence. "Then you best keep an eye on the bank," he said finally. "Men like that, they always follow the money." As Kane left, Elena Valdez approached the shop, carrying her usual basket of fresh bread and stew. The young schoolteacher had made it her habit to bring Solomon dinner, claiming he'd forget to eat otherwise. She'd witnessed the exchange from across the street, and something about the way the old blacksmith had handled himself, the stillness, the control, the underlying tension, made her wonder what secrets lay beneath his quiet exterior. "Mr. Reed," she called softly, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the hammer. "Is this a bad time?" Solomon looked up, his expression softening slightly at the sight of her. Eleanor was one of the few people in town who treated him like more than just the local smithy. "Never a bad time for you, Miss Valdez. What's troubling you?" She set her basket down, her dark eyes serious. "Those men, they seemed dangerous." A grim smile touched Solomon's weathered face. "Most men who try to look dangerous usually aren't, Miss Valdez. It's the quiet ones you need to watch out for." He paused, testing the edge of a newly forged blade. "Always the quiet ones." Something in his voice made Elena wonder just how quiet Solomon Reed really was, and what storms lurked beneath that carefully maintained silence. As the sun disappeared behind the canyon walls, casting the workshop into shadow, the steady ring of his hammer continued, each strike a reminder of the peace he'd found and the violence he'd left behind. Or so he thought. The evening grew darker as Solomon continued his work, the orange glow of the forge casting dancing shadows on the walls. Elena sat at her usual spot near the workbench, grading papers while occasionally glancing up to watch him work. The sound of his hammer had become as familiar to her as the school bell, a steady rhythm that seemed to keep time for the whole town. "Mr. Reed," she ventured, setting aside her papers, "how long have you been a blacksmith?" Solomon paused, considering the question. "Learned the trade from my father back in Missouri, but been working on my own." He gestured to the worn wooden beams of the shop. "Going on 30 years now." "And before that?" Elena's question was, and careful, measured. Solomon's hands stilled on his hammer. "Before that, I made different things. Fine things. Beautiful things." His voice grew distant. "Dangerous things." The door creaked open again, and young Miguel Santos rushed in, his apprentice's apron already half covered in coal dust despite the late hour. The boy's face was flushed with excitement. "Mr. Reed, the whole town's talking about those riders at the Silver Dollar Saloon. They've been asking questions about you, about your work. They say—" Miguel hesitated, glancing at Elena. They say, "You once made a gun so perfect it could shoot the wings off a fly at 50 paces. That true?" Solomon's response was cut off by the sound of more horses approaching. This time the hoofbeats were urgent, purposeful. Sheriff Kane appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Got word from Santa Rosa," he announced, without preamble. "Hawkins and his gang hit the bank there last week. But that's not the worst of it." He lowered his voice, though only Elena and Miguel were there to hear. "They use special weapons, custom-made guns with silver inlay and scrollwork. Sounds familiar, Solomon?" Eleanor watched as something shifted in Solomon's demeanor. His shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly, and his grip on the hammer tightened. "How many dead?" he asked quietly. "3, including the bank guard who tried to stop them." Kane's voice was heavy with unspoken accusations. "Witnesses say they'd never seen guns like that before. Said they fired truly even at impossible distances, never jammed, never missed." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Solomon turned to his forge, but Elena could see the tension in his movements. "Those weapons," he said finally, "I made them over 15 years ago for a group of Texas Rangers who were hunting Jake Martinez. After Martinez. Killed them all, their equipment disappeared. And now Hawkins has them," Kane concluded. "Question is, what's he planning to do with them here?" Before Solomon could respond, Miguel spoke up from where he'd been working. "Mr. Reed, what's this?" The boy was holding an old leather-bound book he'd found while cleaning, its pages yellowed with age. Solomon moved with surprising speed, taking the book gently but firmly from Miguel's hands. "Something that should have stayed buried," he muttered, but not before Elena caught a glimpse of intricate diagrams and measurements, designs for weapons unlike any she'd seen before. "Those men," she said slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes, "they don't just want you to repair their weapons. They want you to make more like the ones they have." Solomon's silence was answer enough. He carefully placed the book in a hidden compartment beneath his workbench, his movements speaking of long practice at concealing things. "There was a time," he said finally, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the forge, "when I believed my craft could serve justice. That by creating perfect weapons for righteous men, I could help tame the frontier." A bitter smile crossed his face. "Learned the hard way that a weapon serves whoever holds it, and the line between justice and murder is thinner than a hair on a blade's edge." Kane's hand rested on his gun, a gesture that seemed more habit than threat. "Those weapons you made, Solomon, I've heard stories. They say each one was different, crafted specifically for its owner, that you could watch a man draw and know exactly what kind of gun would fit his hand, his style." "Stories," Solomon grunted, but his eyes had taken on a distant look. "Just stories now." Eleanor stood, moving closer to the forge where Solomon had resumed his work. "But stories don't make men like Hawkins come looking," she said softly, "and they don't put that look in your eyes when you talk about the past." The night had fully fallen now, the workshop lit only by the forge's glow and a few flickering lanterns. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the promise of a storm. But inside, the air was thick with unspoken truths and the weight of decisions long past. "Miss Valdez," Solomon said finally, his hammer striking with precise force. "There are some skills that once learned can never be unlearned. Some knowledge that marks a man forever." He lifted the piece of metal he was working on, examining it in the firelight. "The trick isn't in forgetting what you know, it's in choosing, each day, how to use it." As if to punctuate his words, distant thunder rolled across the canyon, a sound like artillery fire in the gathering dark. The storm was coming, in more ways than one, And Solomon Reed knew that soon he would have to decide whether the skills he'd spent 15 years trying to forget would be needed once again to protect the peace he'd found in Copper Canyon. Dawn broke over Copper Canyon, painting the red rock walls with stripes of gold and shadow. Solomon had been at his forge since before sunrise, but he wasn't working on horseshoes or plow blades. His weathered hands moved with focused precision as he examined an old revolver, his fingers tracing the intricate scrollwork that decorated its barrel. "I know this piece," he murmured to himself, holding the gun up to catch the morning light. It was one of Hawkins' men's weapons, dropped in their hasty retreat the night before. The silver inlay caught the sun, revealing a pattern of interwoven leaves and thorns that he hadn't used in 15 years. The door creaked open, and Solomon quickly wrapped the gun in a cloth. But it wasn't Hawkins or his men. It was Old Man Martinez, the owner of the local cantina. His face was ashen. "They're at my place, Solomon," Martinez said without preamble. "Hawkins and 6 others. They've been drinking since midnight, showing off those fancy guns of theirs. But it's what they're saying that you need to hear." Solomon set aside his hammer, noting how the older man's hands trembled. "Tell me." "They're planning something big. A special train's coming through next week, carrying army payroll for 3 territories. They have inside information about the security, the route, everything, but they need something else." Martinez paused, his dark eyes fixed on Solomon. "They need special ammunition, the kind only you know how to make." The significance of this hung in the air like forge smoke. Solomon's custom weapons required equally custom ammunition. Rounds he'd designed himself, crafted to maximize accuracy and stopping power. Without them, the guns were just expensive decorations. How do they know about that? Solomon's voice was dangerously quiet. "There's a man with them now, calls himself Jenkins, says he used to run with Jake Martinez's gang back when I was supplying them," Solomon finished. The name Jenkins stirred something in his memory, a young face among the outlaws, who'd come to his old shop, always hanging back, watching how he worked. Before Martinez could respond, Elena appeared in the doorway. Her usual composed demeanor was shaken. "Mr. Reed, you need to see this." She led them to the schoolhouse where a crowd had gathered. On the building's freshly painted wall, someone had carved a message during the night. "Make the bullets, or we make examples." Sheriff Kane was already there, examining the crude letters. "This isn't just about robbing a train anymore," he said as Solomon approached. "They're trying to force your hand." Solomon touched the wall, his fingers tracing the deep cuts in the wood. "They're amateurs," he said quietly, "playing with things they don't understand." "What do you mean?" Elena asked. "The weapons they have. They're not just guns. Each one was crafted for a specific man, balanced to his draw, his aim, his style. Using them without the right ammunition is dangerous enough. Using them without understanding their nature." He shook his head. "It's like giving a rattlesnake to a child." Kane's hand rested on his gun belt. "Then maybe we should gather some men, stop them before—" "No," Solomon cut him off. "Regular guns against those weapons, even poorly used. They'd cut your men down like wheat." He turned to Elena. "Get the children home. Keep them there." "What are you going to do?" she asked. But something in his expression made her pause. Solomon was already walking back to his shop, his mind racing through calculations he hadn't touched in years. The specific mix of powders, the precise weight of each bullet, the intricate grooves that made his ammunition as distinctive as his weapons. Inside his workshop, he pulled out the hidden compartment where he'd stored the old leather book. Its pages contained more than just weapon designs. They held the formulae for his special ammunition, each recipe tested and refined through years of trial and error. Miguel arrived for his morning lessons, but Solomon sent him home. "Not today, boy. Today the forge is closed, but as he turned to close the door, a familiar voice stopped him. That's not very neighborly. Wade Hawkins stood there, flanked by his men. With them was a lean, weathered man Solomon recognized despite the years. Jenkins, older now, but with the same watchful eyes. "Been a long time, Master Reed," Jenkins said, using the old title that gunsmiths of Solomon's caliber had once commanded. "Still remember how you taught me about metal composition, about how the right alloy could make a bullet fly true even in a storm." "Taught you enough to be dangerous," Solomon replied evenly. "Not enough to be wise." Hawkins stepped forward, his boot heels clicking on the wooden floor. "Enough games. You've seen our message, you know what we want, and you know my answer, do we?" Hawkins smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Jenkins here tells me interesting stories about your work, about how each batch of ammunition had to be blessed before it left your shop, about the rituals you performed over the forget." Solomon's expression didn't change, but inwardly he cursed. He'd hoped those particular secrets had died with Jake Martinez's gang. "Old superstitions," he said dismissively. "Nothing more." "Maybe," Jenkins agreed. "Or maybe that's why every shot fired from one of your guns finds its mark. Why do they never misfire, never jam?" He pulled out one of the custom revolvers, its silver scrollwork dull with tarnish. "But lately they've been temperamental, almost like they know they're being used by the wrong hands." "Metal is metal," Solomon said. "It doesn't know right from wrong." "Then prove it," Hawkins challenged. "Make us the ammunition, show us the ritual, or—" He gestured toward the window, where Eleanor could be seen leading her students away from the schoolhouse. "Well, I think you can guess the alternative." Solomon's hands clenched into fists. The truth was, Jenkins was right, at least partially. The rituals weren't mere superstition, but they weren't magic either. They were a complex process of metal preparation, temperature control, and precise timing that he'd cloaked in ceremony. To protect his secrets. "You want ammunition?" he said finally. "Fine, but it has to be done my way. No shortcuts, no questions, no interference." "How long?" Hawkins demanded. 3 days. The metal needs time to season. The molds need to be prepared. This was true, but Solomon also needed time to plan. "And I'll need specific materials." "Write them down," Hawkins ordered, tossing a piece of paper onto the workbench. "Jenkins, we'll know if you're trying to deceive us." As Solomon began listing the requirements, specific metals, rare earths, and chemicals that would indeed be needed for the ammunition, his mind was already working on a different problem. The weapons these men carried weren't just guns, they were his masterworks, created in a time when he'd believed he could control who used them and how. Now he had a chance to correct that mistake. But it would require all his skill, all his knowledge, and a type of forge work he hadn't attempted in 15 years. The kind that had made him both famous and infamous in the days when his name was spoken with reverence by lawmen and outlaws alike. "One more thing," he added, setting down the pencil. "I'll need my old tools, all of them. They're stored in a sealed chest beneath the floorboards of my back room." Jenkins nodded approvingly. "He's not lying about that. I remember the chest, ironwood and steel with silver bindings." "Get it," Hawkins ordered 2 of his men. They pried up the floorboards, revealing a chest that seemed to absorb the light around it. As they lifted it onto his workbench, Solomon felt the weight of his past pressing down on him. Inside that chest were tools he'd sworn never to use again. Tools that could create weapons of incredible power or unmake them entirely. 3 days, Hawkins repeated, and just to make sure you're properly motivated. He nodded to Jenkins, who drew his gun with frightening speed and fired. The shot hit one of Elena's flower pots outside the shop, shattering it to pieces. "Next time it won't be pottery." After they left, Solomon opened the chest slowly. The day Tools inside gleamed as if they'd been polished yesterday. The special hammers, the blessed tongs, the molds that could shape metal in ways that seemed to defy nature itself. "What are you going to do?" Elena's voice came from the doorway. She'd returned after hearing the gunshot, her face pale but determined. Solomon lifted out a peculiar hammer, its head etched with symbols that seemed to shift in the light. "What I should have done 15 years ago," he said quietly. "I'm going to unmake what I made. But first—" He turned to face her fully. "I need you to get a message to Sheriff Kane. Tell him to send word to every law office within riding distance. In 3 days, Copper Canyon is going to need all the help it can get." As Eleanor hurried away, Solomon began heating his forge to temperatures he hadn't used in years. The special weapons he'd created had nearly destroyed one town already. He wouldn't let them destroy another, but unmaking such weapons was even more dangerous than creating them. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and the consequences would be catastrophic. As he began the careful process of preparing his forge, Solomon remembered why he'd hidden these tools away in the first place. Because some kinds of knowledge, once used, marked a man forever. And some kinds of power, once unleashed, could never truly be contained, only redirected, like the flow of molten metal into a mold that would either create a masterpiece or destroy everything its maker held dear. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows through the workshop as Solomon began the meticulous process of preparing his special forge. This wasn't the same one he used for everyday work. This forge had been sealed behind a false wall, preserved exactly as he'd left it 15 years ago. Its construction was unlike anything most blacksmiths had ever seen, with chambers designed to reach temperatures that could alter metal on a fundamental level. Miguel had returned, despite being sent home earlier. The boy watched in fascination as Solomon uncovered equipment he'd never seen before. "Mr. Reed," Miguel ventured, "what are these markings?" He pointed to strange symbols etched into the forge's surface. "Temperature guides," Solomon replied, though that wasn't the whole truth. Each mark represents a specific heat, a precise moment when the metal is ready to be worked. He paused, studying his apprentice's eager face. "Miguel, what I'm about to do, it's not something that should be passed on. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share." "Is that why you stopped making weapons?" Solomon's hands stilled on the forge. "Partly, but mainly because I learned that a weapon remembers its maker's intent. These guns I made years ago, I crafted them for men I believed would use them justly. When those men died and the weapons passed to others," he shook his head, "they became unpredictable, dangerous in ways that went beyond simple mechanics." Eleanor returned with news. "Sheriff Kane has sent riders to Santa Fe and Tucson." "But Mr. Reed—" She hesitated. "There's something else. Jenkins was asking questions at the saloon about the night Jake Martinez died, about what really happened at Dead Horse Creek." Solomon's expression darkened. Dead Horse Creek was a name he hadn't heard spoken in years. What exactly did he want to know? About the strange lights people reported seeing, about how every bullet fired that night found its mark, even in pitch darkness, about how Jake Martinez's famous silver-plated revolvers melted in his hands. Superstitious. "And nonsense," Solomon muttered, but his hands had begun trembling slightly. The truth about Dead Horse Creek was something he'd never shared. How he'd discovered, quite by accident, that metal worked under certain conditions, blessed with certain rituals, could develop properties that defied explanation. How he'd used that knowledge to create weapons of incredible power, each one unique to its intended owner. And how, when Jake Martinez had turned those weapons against innocent people, Solomon had found a way to unmake them, a process that had nearly cost him his life. Sheriff Kane arrived as the sun was setting, his young face grave. Got word from up north. Hawkins' gang isn't just planning to rob that payroll train. They're planning to take the whole train, passengers and all. They'll need hostages for what comes next. Which is? Solomon asked, though he suspected he already knew. They're going to try to take Copper Canyon, turn it into their own private fortress. With these mountains at their backs and your weapons in their hands, they figure no army in the territory could dig them out. Elena gasped softly. But why here? Why now? Because of me, Solomon said quietly. They need my skills, yes, but more than that, they need my forge, the one place where their stolen weapons can be maintained, where the special ammunition can be crafted. He turned to Cain. How many men can you gather in 3 days? Maybe 20, but against those weapons. The weapons won't matter, Solomon interrupted. Not if I do this right. He pulled out his old leather-bound book, turning to pages he hadn't looked at in years. But I'll need help. Miguel, you'll have to assist me with the forge. Elena, I need you to gather certain materials, herbs and minerals from the canyon. And Sheriff, I need you to make sure Hawkins and his men don't realize what we're really doing until it's too late. As they gathered around his workbench, Solomon began to explain his plan. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was the only way to ensure that his creations would never threaten another innocent life. The wind picked up outside, carrying the scent of sage and imminent rain. A storm was coming to Copper Canyon, one that would either cleanse it of the violence men like Hawkins brought or sweep away everything Solomon had built in the years since Dead Horse Creek. He looked at the faces around him. Elena's determination, Miguel's youth and eagerness, Cain's steady resolve, and knew that whatever happened, he was no longer facing this burden alone. The time had come to finally confront the full consequences of his craft and to prove that the power to unmake could be just as important as the power to create. The first night of Solomon's 3-day deadline brought no rest to his workshop. By lamplight, he and Miguel worked at the special forge, its heat casting an otherworldly glow through the shop's windows. The strange symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift and dance in the flickering light. "Pass me the silver nitrate," Solomon instructed, his voice tight with concentration. Miguel hurried to comply, handling the bottle with careful reverence. The young apprentice had never seen his master work like this, every movement precise, every measurement exact, as if the slightest error could bring catastrophe. Elena entered, quietly, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. "I found everything you asked for," she whispered, setting it down. Inside were rare minerals and herbs gathered from the deepest parts of the canyon, materials that seemed more suited to an alchemist's laboratory than a blacksmith's forge. "Good," Solomon nodded, not looking up from his work. "Now watch carefully. Both of you. What I'm about to do isn't smithing, not really. It's something older." He began mixing the materials in specific proportions, adding them to a crucible already glowing with molten metal. The mixture sparked and swirled with unusual colors, deep purples and greens that had no place in normal forge work. In the old days, Solomon explained as he worked, smiths were more than just metal workers. They were keepers of secrets, makers of things that straddled the line between craft and sorcery. His hands moved in practiced patterns over the crucible. Most of that knowledge was lost, but some of us found ways to rediscover it. A sharp knock at the door made them all jump. Sheriff Cain entered, his expression grim. "Riders coming. Hawkins wants to check your progress." Solomon quickly covered the crucible. "Elena, Miguel, out the back. Remember what I taught you about the next steps." As they slipped away, Hawkins strode in with Jenkins and 2 others. The outlaw's eyes went immediately to the strange forge and the covered crucible. "Making progress, I see," Hawkins observed, reaching for the cover. "Touch that and you'll lose your hand," Solomon said quietly. "The metal's at a delicate stage. Expose it to air now." and 3 days' work becomes 3 days wasted. Jenkins stepped forward, studying the setup with knowing eyes. He's right, Wade. I remember this part. The metal has to be seasoned, like aging fine whiskey. Hawkins snorted but withdrew his hand. Just make sure you're not playing us false, old man. We've got men watching every trail out of town. No one leaves without. Our say-so. Speaking of leaving, Jenkins added, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. Tell me something, Master Reed. That night at Dead Horse Creek, how did you do it? How did you turn Jake Martinez's own guns against him? The question hung in the air, like smoke. Solomon continued working, his movements unhurried. You seem awfully interested in old stories, Jenkins. Almost like you're searching for something specific. Just trying to understand the craft, Jenkins replied smoothly. After all, I might be the only one left alive who saw what those guns could really do. How they never missed, how they could shoot around corners, how they— Enough, Hawkins interrupted. We're not here for stories. Show us what you've done so far. Solomon gestured to a row of molds cooling near the forge. First stage of the casting. Has to cool naturally, can't rush it. By morning they'll be ready for the next phase, which is tempering, with very specific materials. Solomon pointed to Elena's basket. Those herbs and minerals, they're not for show. Each one plays a part in the process. Jenkins nodded slowly. I remember the smells, like lightning about to strike, like metal singing. Something in his voice made Solomon look at him sharply. The man knew too much, remembered too much, and there was something else, something in the way he kept touching the gun at his hip, as if reassuring himself it was still there. After they left, Kane emerged from the shadows where he'd been watching. Jenkins concerns me, the sheriff said quietly. He's not like the others. He understands what these weapons really are. Yes, Solomon agreed, uncovering the crucible. The metal inside had turned a deep, impossible blue, which makes him the most dangerous one of all, because he knows just enough to be deadly, but not enough to be wise. The night deepened as Solomon returned to his work. The process he'd begun wasn't just about unmaking weapons, it was about unmaking the very principles that made them special. Each step had to be precise, each material added at exactly the right moment. Elena returned with Miguel, and Solomon put them to work preparing the next phase. As they worked, he explained the true nature of what they were doing. A weapon made with these methods, he said, carefully measuring out a powder that seemed to catch light from nowhere, becomes more than just metal and wood. It becomes a reflection of its maker's intent, bound by the rituals and materials used in its creation. Is that why they never miss? Miguel asked, fascinated. They miss plenty, Solomon corrected, but only when they're being used against their purpose. The guns I made for lawmen would never shoot true for outlaws. The weapons I crafted for protecting the innocent would become unreliable in the hands of murderers. Then how are Hawkins and his men using them at all? Elena wondered. Because they stole them before their original owners died in battle. The weapons never had a chance to fully reject them, but they're growing more unstable by the day. He smiled grimly. That's why they need me. The guns are starting to fight back against being misused. A sudden commotion outside drew their attention. Shots rang out in the distance, followed by shouts and the thunder of hooves. Kane burst in, out of breath. Trouble at the south end of town. 2 of Hawkins' men got drunk, started shooting up the saloon. But that's not the worst part. He paused, catching his breath. A rider just came in from Fort Apache, the payroll train. It's not just carrying money, it's carrying something else. Something they're calling classified military cargo. Solomon's hands stilled on his tools. What kind of cargo? Don't know, but whatever it is, it's got the army sending a full company of cavalry to guard it. They'll be here the day after tomorrow. Same day the ammunition is supposed to be ready. Elena realized. Not a coincidence, Solomon said grimly. Hawkins isn't just planning to rob a train. He's after whatever that cargo is. and he needs working weapons to do it. He turned to his forge, where the mysterious blue metal still swirled and shifted. We need to work faster. Miguel, stoke the fire. Elena, prepare the sage and silver root mixture. And Thomas, he looked at the sheriff, get word to those army troops. Tell them what they're riding into. But make sure Hawkins doesn't find out they've been warned. As they rushed to comply, Solomon opened his old book to a page he'd hoped never to use again. The instructions there weren't for making weapons, but for unmaking them in the most complete way possible. It was dangerous knowledge, the kind that had nearly killed him at Dead Horse Creek. But as he began the complex process, a noise at the window caught his attention. A shadow moved against the stars. Someone had been watching, listening. By the time Solomon reached the window, the eavesdropper was gone, leaving only footprints in the dust. Small footprints, like those of a man who'd spent years hanging back, watching, learning the secrets of a craft that was never meant to be shared. Jenkins had just complicated everything. The question was, what would he do with what he'd overheard? The night grew deeper, and in Solomon Reed's workshop, the forge burned with colors that nature never intended, as an old craftsman raced against time to undo the most dangerous things he'd ever created. Solomon worked through the deepening night, his movements growing more precise as exhaustion threatened to overtake him. Each step in the unmaking process required absolute concentration. One wrong move, one misaligned symbol, and the consequences would be catastrophic. There's something you're not telling us, Elena observed, watching him trace intricate patterns into a cooling ingot. About Jenkins, about what really happened at Dead Horse Creek. Solomon's hands stilled for a moment. Jenkins wasn't just watching and learning back then. He was stealing. Little bits of knowledge, pieces of the craft that were never meant to be separated from the whole. He resumed his work, but his voice grew harder. That's why the incident at Dead Horse Creek happened in the first place. What do you mean? Miguel asked, looking up from where he was grinding rare minerals into powder. Jenkins sold incomplete information to Jake Martinez, told him how to modify the weapons, but didn't understand the consequences. When Martinez tried to alter the gun's nature, Solomon shook his head. It backfired, literally. The weapons didn't just reject him, they turned on him, but not before he'd killed 12 innocent people. Kane, who had returned from sending messages to the army patrol, leaned against the doorframe, and now Jenkins is working with Hawkins. Not working with, Solomon corrected. Using. Jenkins has spent 15 years trying to piece together the full craft. Now he's got access to my forge, my tools, my methods. He gestured to the window where they'd seen the footprints. And he's learning more every time he watches. A distant explosion rocked the night, making them all jump. Kane rushed to the door, his gun drawn. Through the windows they could see an orange glow coming from the south end of town. The ammunition store, Kane growled. They're destroying it, making sure no one else in town has working bullets when the time comes. Solomon nodded grimly. Hawkins is smarter than I gave him credit for. Or maybe Jenkins is advising him better than we thought. He turned to Eleanor. Get word to the townspeople. Tell them to gather at the church tomorrow at first light. We need to get the women and children to safety before... He stopped abruptly, his eyes fixed on something in his old book. The page had fallen open to a diagram he hadn't looked at in years. A design for a special kind of ammunition mold that could produce bullets capable of piercing any metal, even his own specially crafted gun barrels. Miguel, he said quietly, bring me the ironwood box from beneath the workbench, the small one with silver clasps. Inside the box was a single bullet, tarnished with age. Solomon held it up to the lamplight, revealing markings similar to those on his forge. I only made 3 of these, he explained. Used 2 at Dead Horse Creek. This is the last one, a fail-safe, in case my weapons ever fall into the wrong hands. Again, what does it do? Miguel asked in hushed tones. It unmakes them completely. One shot from this into one of my specially crafted weapons, and the gun doesn't just break, it unravels. All the power, all the special properties, they just dissolve. Then why haven't you used it already? Kane demanded. Because it has to be fired from one of my master weapons. The originals I made before I started taking commissions. And the last one of those is hidden where no one can find it. Elena's eyes widened with understanding. The silver gun, they you buried at Dead Horse Creek, the one that killed Jake Martinez. Solomon nodded slowly. And now we have less than 2 days to retrieve it, while Hawkins' men watch every trail out of town. Through the window they could see more fires being lit. Hawkins's men systematically destroying every source of conventional ammunition in Copper Canyon. Soon, the only working bullets would be the ones Solomon was supposed to be making. Kane checked his own gun, grimacing. I've got maybe 20 rounds left. Not nearly enough to hold off Hawkins' gang when they make their move. We're not going to hold them off, Solomon said, beginning to pack specific tools into a leather satchel. We're going to end this. But first, he turned to Elena. I need you to create a diversion, something big enough to draw attention away from the North Trail out of town. The school play, she said immediately. We were planning it for next week, but I could announce we're doing it tomorrow night instead. The whole town will be there. Good. Miguel, you'll help her. Make it look like we're all focused on keeping things normal despite Hawkins' presence. He turned to Kane. Sheriff, I need you to do something that goes against every lawman's instinct. I need you to look the other way while I slip out of town. To Dead Horse Creek? Kane asked. That's 2 days' ride each way. You'll never make it back in time. Solomon smiled grimly. Dead Horse Creek is exactly where Jenkins expects me to go. The real gun is somewhere much closer, but getting to it, he looked at the strange metal cooling in his forge. That's going to require a different kind of craft altogether. The night was turning to grey dawn, and somewhere in the growing light, Jenkins was undoubtedly plotting his own moves in this dangerous game. But Solomon Reed had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, and he hadn't been entirely honest about what he'd been creating in his forge these past hours. Sometimes, the best way to unmake a weapon was to forge a better one. Dawn painted the canyon walls in shades of amber as Solomon made his final preparations. The special forge had cooled, but the metal it had produced gleamed with an inner light that shouldn't have been possible, a soft blue radiance that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Remember, he told Elena as he wrapped the mysterious metal in oiled cloth. The school play needs to be convincing. Get every child involved, every parent. Make it impossible for Hawkins' men to tell what's real and what's staged. Elena nodded, her face set with determination. I've already sent word around. We're doing The Legend of Sleeping Beauty. Fitting, since it's about things hidden and awakening. She paused, studying his face. But you still haven't told us where you're really going. Solomon secured the package inside his leather satchel. Better you don't know. Jenkins has ways of getting information out of people. Subtle ways that don't leave marks, but loosen tongues. You mean like he did with Reverend Parker? Kane asked from the doorway. Solomon's head snapped up. What about Parker? Found him this morning in his study. Doesn't remember the last 6 hours, but he's been writing something over and over in his ledger. Kane handed Solomon a piece of paper. Just these words, the gun lies where the hanged man points. Solomon's face went pale. So Jenkins is already using the old methods. Crude, but effective. He crumpled the paper, tossing it into the forge where it burst into blue-tinted flames. He's better at this than I thought. We need to move faster. Miguel burst into the shop, out of breath. Mr. Reed, Hawkins' men, they're searching every building in town, looking for something specific, they say. They're heading this way. Right on time, Solomon muttered. He turned to Kane. Sheriff, I need you to arrest me. What? Arrest me. Make it public. Say you found evidence I've been helping Hawkins' gang all along. Solomon began gathering specific tools, sliding them into hidden pockets. It's the only way I'll be able to move freely. Elena caught on first. The jail. It's the only place they won't search thoroughly because they'll think the sheriff has you under guard. And the only place Jenkins won't expect me to hide what I'm really doing, Solomon confirmed. Because he thinks he knows all my tricks, but there are some secrets I never wrote down, some methods I never shared. Kane nodded slowly. And while you're in jail, supposedly under guard, I'll be doing what needs to be done. But first... Solomon pulled out a small wooden box, intricately carved with symbols similar to those on his forge. Miguel, you're now the most important part of this plan. Take this to the old mission at the edge of town. Give it to Sister Maria, only to her, no one else. Tell her it's time to return what she's been guarding. As Miguel slipped out the back with the box, Solomon turned to Elena. The play needs to start exactly at sunset, not a minute before, not a minute after. The timing has to be perfect. Why sunset? Because that's when the metal is most responsive, when the barriers between what is and what could be are thinnest. He smiled at her confusion. Old Smith's wisdom. Probably sounds like superstition to educated folks. After what I've seen in your forge these past days, Elena replied, I'm not sure what to believe anymore. The sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk announced the approach of Hawkins' men. Solomon quickly pulled on his coat, nodding to Kane. Time to arrest your blacksmith, Sheriff. What followed was a piece of theater worthy of Eleanor's upcoming play. Kane burst out of the shop, pushing Solomon ahead of him at gunpoint. Found these in his strong box, the sheriff announced loudly, holding up what appeared to be papers with army letterhead. Been helping plan the train robbery all along. A crowd quickly gathered as Kane marched Solomon toward the jail. Among them, Solomon spotted Jenkins, watching with eyes that missed nothing. Good. Let him think he knew what was happening. Inside the jail, Kane made a show of locking Solomon in the center cell, the only one whose back wall shared a foundation, with the old silver mine that had given birth to Copper Canyon. As soon as the crowd dispersed, Solomon began working, pulling tools from hidden pockets. The wall's solid rock, Kane whispered. How are you going to... He stopped as Solomon pressed his hand against the stone, whispering words that sounded like a smith's blessing, but felt like something much older. The rock began to soften, not like metal in a forge, but like clay becoming pliable. There are more ways to shape stone than with picks and dynamite, Solomon said quietly. The first smiths knew this. They understood that all matter, metal, stone, even air, could be worked if you knew its true nature. That's how you hid your master gun, Kane realized. You didn't bury it at Dead Horse Creek. You merged it with living rock. Solomon nodded, his hands moving in complex patterns over the softening stone. And now, I'm going to call it back, but I'll need time, and I'll need you to make sure no one comes into this cell block. What I'm about to do, it's not something meant for ordinary eyes. As Kane left to stand guard, Solomon began a process that was ancient when the first Spanish missionaries arrived in these lands. His fingers traced patterns in the stone that seemed to draw themselves, guided by knowledge that lived in his bones, rather than his mind. Outside, the sound of hammering began, workers preparing the stage for Elena's play. But in the deepening shadows of the jail cell, Solomon Reed worked with forces that had nothing to do with nails and lumber, and everything to do with the fundamental nature of creation itself. The master gun was calling to him from within the living rock. Now he just had to convince it to wake up. As the afternoon light filtered through the jail's high windows, Solomon worked with increasing urgency. His fingers moved across the stone, all with practiced precision, tracing patterns that seemed to shimmer in the air before sinking into the rock. With each passing moment, The wall became more translucent, revealing shadowy shapes within its depths. A commotion outside drew his attention. Through the cell's small window, he could see Hawkins's men forcing their way into the church, disrupting preparations for the play. Elena stood her ground in the doorway, every inch the protective schoolteacher. "This is a place of worship," she declared loudly enough for her voice to carry to the jail. "If you want to search it, you'll need every child's parent to be present." Solomon smiled grimly. Elena was playing her part perfectly, creating delays, forcing Hawkins' men to waste time following proper social protocols. But his satisfaction was short-lived as he spotted Jenkins moving through the crowd, his eyes fixed on the jail's exterior wall. Inside his cell, Solomon worked faster. The stone had become almost fluid under his touch, revealing more of what lay within. The grip of his master gun was becoming visible, a piece of artistry that put all his later works to shame. Its barrel was inscribed with symbols that made his forge markings look crude by comparison. Sheriff Kane's boots sounded on the jail's wooden floor. "Jenkins is asking questions about the jail's foundation," he reported in a whisper. "Says there's something wrong with the stone. Says it's singing to him." Solomon cursed softly. "He's learned more than I thought. Get back outside. Keep him occupied. I need 10 more minutes." But before Kane could respond, another voice joined their whispered conversation, young Miguel appearing at the cell window. "Mr. Reed," the boy hissed urgently. "Sister Maria isn't at the mission. She left a message, says she had to move the package because someone was asking too many questions. She's taken it to where the angels watch." Solomon's hands stilled. "On the wall. The old cemetery," he breathed. "Of course, the angel statues I forged for the graves of the town's founders." "Clever woman," he turned to Miguel. "Did you see anyone following you?" "No, but—" Miguel hesitated. "There's something else. I overheard 2 of Hawkins' men talking about the military cargo on the train. They said it's not money or gold. They said it's some kind of new weapon, something that needs special ammunition to work." The implications hit Solomon like a physical blow. "That's why they need my bullets, not for the guns they stole, for whatever's on that train." He pressed his hand flat against the wall, whispering words that made the stone pulse with inner light. "Miguel, get to Elena. Tell her to start the play early. We can't wait for sunset anymore." As Miguel disappeared, Solomon returned to his work with renewed urgency. The wall had become almost transparent now, revealing the full form of his masterwork. The gun wasn't just hidden in the stone, it had become part of it, its metal combining with the living rock in ways that defied normal physics. Kane watched in fascination as Solomon began the final stage of the extraction. "I've never seen anything like this," he murmured. "No one has, not for centuries," Solomon replied, his voice strained with effort. "The old smiths, they understood that metal and stone were just different states of the same essence. They could flow one into the other, merge them, separate them." His fingers traced a final pattern, but the knowledge was lost, deemed too dangerous by those who couldn't understand it. The gun began to emerge from the wall like a sword being drawn from water. Its surface rippled with colors that shouldn't exist in nature, deep blues and purples that seemed to move of their own accord. Suddenly, the jail's front door burst open. Jenkins stood there, his eyes wide with a hunger that had nothing to do with normal greed. "I knew it," he breathed, staring at the partially emerged weapon. "I knew you hadn't just buried it. You merged it with the earth itself." He drew his own gun, one of Solomon's later works. "Step away from the wall, Master Reed. That gun belongs to those who truly understand its power." Solomon didn't move. "You understand nothing, Jenkins. You've spent 15 years gathering pieces of knowledge, but you never learned the most important lesson." His hand closed around the grip of his master gun, still half embedded in the stone. "The craft isn't about power, it's about responsibility." Responsibility. Jenkins laughed harshly. "Is that why you hid your greatest works?" Why do you stop making weapons that could have changed the territory forever? The world needs this knowledge, Solomon, needs what you can create. The world isn't ready, Solomon replied. Men like you prove that. You think these weapons are tools of power, but they're something else entirely. They're judgments, Jenkins, each one a test of the soul that wields it. Outside they could hear Elena's children beginning their play. The sound of their singing provided a stark counterpoint to the tension in the jail cell. Jenkins took a step forward, his stolen gun aimed steadily at Solomon's heart. "Step away from the wall, old man. Don't make me show you how well I've learned to use your creations." Solomon's eyes met Jenkins without fear. "You still don't understand. These guns, these weapons, they remember who made them. They remember what they were made for." His voice took on a rhythmic quality like a smith's blessing. "And they remember who betrayed their purpose." The gun in Jenkins' hand began to tremble. The gun in Jenkins' hand shook violently, its ornate scrollwork beginning to glow with an unnatural light. Behind him, Sheriff Kane had drawn his own weapon, but Solomon shook his head slightly. This wasn't a fight that could be won with ordinary bullets. "What's happening?" Jenkins demanded, struggling to keep his grip on the trembling weapon. "What are you doing?" "I'm not doing anything," Solomon replied calmly, his hand still resting on his master gun in the wall. "The weapon is remembering the hands that crafted it, the purpose it was meant to serve." His voice took on a deeper resonance. "Remembering that you helped Jake Martinez corrupt its brothers, twist them from their true purpose." The metal of Jenkins's gun began to take on a reddish hue, as if it were heating in an invisible forge. Smoke curled from his grip, but he couldn't seem to let go. "Impossible!" Jenkins gasped, his face contorted in pain. "They're just metal and wood." "That's where you went wrong," Solomon said, beginning to draw his master gun further from the living rock. "You stole the methods, the formulas, even the blessing words, but you never understood the heart of the craft." The wall around his weapon rippled like water. "These guns aren't just weapons, they're judges, created to serve justice itself. And now they're judging you." Outside, the children's play continued, their sweet voices singing about sleeping beauties and awakening powers. The irony wasn't lost on Solomon as his master gun finally emerged fully from the stone wall. Its surface rippled with colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Deep blues and purples that seemed to move of their own accord. Jenkins' stolen weapon was now glowing cherry red, the elaborate scrollwork appearing to writhe like living things. "Make it stop!" he screamed, his hand smoking where it gripped the gun. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his master gun, a weight that went beyond mere physics. This weapon had been his first masterwork, created when he still believed that righteous violence could solve the world's ills. He'd learned, better since then, learned that true justice rarely came from the barrel of a gun, but sometimes, to restore balance, one had to fight fire with fire, or in this case, fight corrupted steel with steel that remembers its true purpose. Solomon stepped out of the jail cell, his boot heels ringing on the wooden floor. Jenkins lay still against the wall, the judgment of his stolen weapon marked in burns across his hands. He would recover, eventually, and maybe, if he survived what was coming, he would finally understand the true meaning of the craft he'd tried to steal. Outside, the last light of day painted Copper Canyon in colors that almost matched the otherworldly sheen of Solomon's gun. Hawkins and his men waited in the street, their stolen weapons drawn, not realizing that each gun was now a potential betrayer, each one remembering its true nature, awakening to the presence of the master weapon that had come before them all. Solomon straightened his shoulders, feeling the years fall away. He wasn't just a blacksmith anymore, but he wasn't returning to being just a weapon maker either. He was something older, something that the ancient smiths had been before progress reduced their craft to mere metalworking. He was a maker of justice, a forger of balance, a keeper of knowledge that was never meant to be used lightly, and it was time to remind these men why the old ways had been hidden in the first place. As Solomon stepped out onto the jail's wooden porch, the last rays of sunlight caught his master gun's barrel, sending cascades of impossible colors dancing across the street. Hawkins and his men instinctively stepped back, their stolen weapons wavering in suddenly uncertain hands. "What's wrong, boys?" Solomon called out, his voice carrying the same resonant power that he used in blessing newly forged metal. "Those guns not feeling quite as friendly as they did this morning?" Hawkins tried to steady his aim, but his weapon was visibly trembling. "What did you do to Jenkins? We heard him screaming." Jenkins learned a hard lesson about stealing power he didn't understand. Solomon descended the steps slowly, each movement measured and deliberate. "Same lesson you're all about to learn." From the church came Elena's voice, leading the children in another verse of their play, but now her words carried a different weight. The night approached the dragon's lair, bearing steel that sang with sacred fire. The stolen guns in the outlaw's hands began to hum, a sound like a forger's bellows mixed with distant thunder. One of Hawkins' men cursed and dropped his weapon, shaking his smoking hand. "See, there's something Jenkins never told you about these guns," Solomon continued, moving into the street with the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly what was about to happen. "Each one was made for a specific purpose, blessed with particular intentions. The one you're holding, Hawkins, that was made for Marshal James Cooper, meant to protect settlers heading west. It was never meant to be used for robbery or murder." As if in response to his words, the scrollwork on Hawkins' gun began to glow with an angry red light. The outlaw leader tried to drop it, but like Jenkins before him, he found he couldn't let go. "What's happening?" he demanded, panic creeping into his voice. "Justice," Solomon replied simply. "The kind that can't be escaped or argued with. The kind that lives in the metal itself." From behind the outlaws came new voices, Sister Maria leading a procession from the old cemetery. She carried Miguel's wooden box, now open to reveal its contents. Bullets, similar to the ones in Solomon's. Master gun, each one gleaming with that same otherworldly light. "I found these right where you left them," Sister Maria called out, her aged voice strong and clear, buried beneath the angel statue, waiting for the day they'd be needed. Solomon nodded in appreciation. "The old ways endure, sister. Even when we try to forget them," Hawkins, fighting against his rebellious weapon, snarled in frustration. "Enough of this devil's work. Boys, shoot him!" But his men were having their own problems. Each stolen gun was now actively fighting its wielder, their metal surfaces rippling with colors that spoke of judgment and retribution. "You still don't understand," Solomon said, raising his master gun. "These weapons weren't just made to shoot, they were made to serve justice itself, and now they're going to do exactly that." He fired a single shot into the air. The effect was immediate and extraordinary. Every stolen weapon in the street began to transform. Their metal seemed to liquefy, running like quicksilver through their wielders' fingers. But instead of falling to the ground, the liquid metal flowed through the air, drawn to Solomon's master gun like iron filings to a lodestone. Hawkins watched in horror as his prized weapon dissolved in his hands. What are they?" "They're returning to their source," Solomon explained, his master gun absorbing the flowing metal of its corrupted children, being unmade and remade, returning to what they were always meant to be. From the church doorway, Elena gasped as she witnessed the impossible scene. The stolen guns had become streams of living metal, flowing through the evening air in ribbons of silver and steel that caught the last sunlight like liquid fire. Miguel, standing beside Sister Maria, watched in fascination. "Mr. Reed," he called. "Out of the metal, it's singing. Indeed, a strange harmony filled the air, like distant bells, mixed with the ring of hammer on anvil. It was the sound of metal returning to its true nature, of corruption being burned away by something older and purer than mere physical laws. Sheriff Kane emerged from behind the jail, his own gun trained steadily on Hawkins' men. But it wasn't needed. Without their stolen weapons, the outlaws' courage had evaporated like morning dew. "On your knees," Kane ordered, and they complied without resistance. As the last of the corrupted weapons was absorbed into his master gun, Solomon felt the weight of years lift from his shoulders. He wasn't just correcting an old mistake, he was fulfilling the true purpose of his craft, using it not to create instruments of death, but to restore balance to a world that had strayed too far from justice. "The weapons are gone," Hawkins said numbly, staring at his empty hands. "But the army train will be met by forces it can handle," Solomon finished. He turned to Kane. "The cavalry troops you warned, they'll be here by midnight. And now, Hawkins' men have no special weapons to fight them with." Elena approached slowly, her dark eyes filled with wonder. "Is it over, then?" Solomon looked at his master gun, its surface still rippling with the power of what it had absorbed. "Almost. There's still the matter of what to do with all this restored metal. Can't let it be turned into weapons again." Sister Maria smiled, knowingly. "The mission bells need recasting," she suggested. "They've been cracked for years." Solomon nodded slowly, understanding the perfect symmetry of it. Metal that had been corrupted for death would be reborn to ring out life and hope across the canyon. But as Kane and his deputies began shackling the subdued outlaws, a weak laugh came from the jail's doorway. Jenkins had regained consciousness and now leaned heavily against the frame, his burned hands cradled against his chest. "You think this is over?" he wheezed. "You think unmaking the guns solves everything? You forgot about the military cargo? Old man, you forgot what's really coming on that train?" The smile that crossed Solomon's weathered face took Jenkins aback. "No," the old blacksmith said quietly. "I didn't forget. I just needed the right metal to deal with it." He patted his master gun meaningfully. "And now I have exactly what I need." The sun had fully set now, but in the growing darkness, Solomon's gun still gleamed with inner light, the combined essence of all his corrupted creations, purified and ready to serve their true purpose once again. Night had fully claimed Copper Canyon, but an otherworldly glow still emanated from Solomon's workshop. Inside, the special forge burned again, its flames tinged with colors that shouldn't exist as the old blacksmith worked with the reclaimed metal from his corrupted weapons. "The military cargo," Elena said, watching him shape the molten metal. With practiced movements, Jenkins seemed almost gleeful when he mentioned it. What could be so terrible? Solomon's hands never stopped moving as he worked. "During the war, I was approached by military men, scientists they called themselves. They wanted to understand how I made my special weapons. I refused." His hammer struck with precise force. But others didn't. Other craftsmen who knew pieces of the old ways agreed to help them create something new, something that should never have been made. Kane leaned forward, his badge catching the forge's strange light. "What did they make?" "A cannon," Solomon replied grimly, "but not like any you've ever seen. It doesn't fire shells or grape shot. It fires possibilities." He pulled a piece of glowing metal from the forge. "They found a way to twist the old craft, to make weapons that don't just kill the body. They rewrite the very nature of what they strike." Miguel, who had been quietly assisting with the forge, dropped his tongs with a clatter. "Like your guns changing the metal back there in the street? Similar principle, boy, but used for destruction instead of restoration. Each shot from this cannon doesn't just destroy its target, it changes what that target was, is, and could be." Solomon's voice grew heavy with concern. One shot could turn a cavalry charge into a field of salt, turn living men into pillars of glass, turn an entire town into something that never existed at all. Elena gasped softly. And that's what's on the train. That's what Hawkins and his men were really after. That's what Jenkins was after, Solomon corrected. Hawkins was just a tool, muscle to help move the cannon, victims to test it on. Jenkins wanted the weapon for himself, wanted to combine its power with what he'd stolen from my craft. He smiled grimly. That's why he was so interested in my ammunition. The cannon requires special shells to work, shells made with methods similar to mine. Sister Maria spoke up from where she sat in the corner, her gnarled hands working a rosary. But you've taken back the corrupted metal. Surely that means... It means we have a chance, Solomon interrupted. The metal remembers its true purpose now, and with my master gun restored to full power. He lifted the weapon, its surface still rippling with impossible colors. We might be able to stop what's coming, but we'll need help. As if in answer to his words, the sound of approaching horses filled the night air. Kane moved to the window. Cavalry's here, he announced. Full company, just like you asked for. Solomon nodded in satisfaction. Good, they'll handle Hawkins' remaining men, but the real fight... He turned back to his forge. The real fight will be different. This cannon, it's an abomination. A twisting of crafts that were meant to serve. Life, not unmake it. It has to be stopped before it reaches any populated area. How? Elena asked. If it can change the very nature of what it strikes. Solomon pulled something from the forge. A bullet unlike any they'd ever seen. Its surface swirled with the combined essence of all his reclaimed weapons, but there was something more. Symbols traced themselves across its surface, appearing and disappearing like living things. Sometimes, he said quietly, to unmake something. Truly evil, you have to be willing to unmake part of yourself as well. He held up the bullet. This contains everything I know of the craft, every secret, every blessing, every technique. When it strikes the cannon, it won't just destroy it, it will erase the very knowledge that made it possible. But that means... Miguel's eyes widened with understanding. Your craft, your special methods, will be gone, perhaps forever. Solomon's voice held no regret, as they should be. Some knowledge isn't meant to survive its time. The cavalry captain, a young man named Harrison, entered the workshop. His eyes widened at the sight of the strange forge and its otherworldly light, but he maintained his composure. Mr. Reed, he said formally, my men are positioned along the canyon rim. The train will be here within the hour. But, sir, he hesitated, we've received reports from our forward scouts. The men guarding the cannon, they're not normal soldiers. They move wrong, like they're changed somehow. The cannon's effects, Solomon explained, even being near it warps things. Change them. He began loading his master gun with the special ammunition. Captain, your men need to focus on Hawkins's remaining gang. Leave the cannon to me. With all due respect, sir, Harrison replied, my orders are to secure that cargo at any cost. Solomon fixed him with a steady gaze. And what cost would that be, Captain? The lives of your men? The very existence of this town? Some prices are too high even for following orders. Before Harrison could respond, a distant whistle echoed through the canyon, the train approaching from the north. But the sound was wrong somehow, distorted in a way that made the listener's teeth ache. It's beginning, Solomon said grimly. The cannon's influence is already reaching out, trying to change the nature of everything around it. He turned to Elena. Get everyone into the church. The thick walls might offer some protection from what's coming. I'm not hiding, she declared firmly. Not this time. Solomon started to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. He recognized that expression. He'd seen it in his own reflection years ago, when he'd first discovered the true power of his craft. Very well, he conceded. But stay behind me. What's about to happen? It's not something that follows normal rules of nature. The train's whistle sounded again, closer now, and even more distorted. Through the workshop window, they could see strange lights playing across the canyon walls, colors that had no names in any human language. Solomon checked his master gun. One final time. The weapon hummed with power, the combined essence of all his reclaimed creations, singing in its metal. "Captain Harrison," he said, without taking his eyes off the approaching lights, "get your men ready, but give them this warning. If they see something that doesn't make sense, something that seems to defy reality itself, they're to fall back immediately. Don't try to fight it. Don't even look at it directly. Some things can change you just by being seen." The young captain nodded grimly and left to relay the orders. Outside, the cavalry troops took up their positions, their horses already stamping. Nervously at the wrongness in the air, Solomon turned to Miguel. "Boy, stoke up the special forge as hot as it will go. If something happens to me, if I fall—" He pressed a folded paper into the apprentice's hands. "These are the words of unmaking. Read them over the forge. It won't be as complete as what I'm attempting, but it might be enough to prevent the worst." Miguel clutched the paper, his young face pale but determined. "Yes, sir, but you're coming back, aren't you?" The old blacksmith managed to smile. "Planning to. Still have plenty to teach you about honest iron work, but if not," he glanced at Eleanor, "take care of my forge. Use it for good things. For creating, not destroying." The train's whistle screamed again, the sound now so distorted it barely resembled anything mechanical. The strange lights had reached the town's edge, and where they touched, reality seemed to blur and shift. Solomon Reed stepped out of his workshop, his master gun glowing with inner fire, ready to face a weapon that threatened not just lives, but the very fabric of existence itself. Behind him, Elena and Sister Maria began to pray, not just to God, but to whatever ancient powers had first taught men to shape metal and imbue it with purpose. The night was about to become very strange indeed. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong came when the moon's reflection in the water trough began to move in the opposite direction from the real moon above. Then the shadows of buildings began to stretch in impossible directions, some reaching upward instead of across the ground. "Sweet Mother of God," Captain Harrison whispered, watching his own shadow split into 3 distinct shapes, each moving independently. Solomon's master gun thrummed with increasing intensity as the train approached. The weapon seemed to be responding to whatever force was twisting reality around them. Its surface rippled with patterns that spoke of order and purpose, standing firm against the chaos, trying to unmake the world. "Mr. Reed," Eleanor called from the workshop doorway, "the forge, it's changing color." Solomon turned to see his special, forge burning with a light that seemed to consume darkness rather than illuminate it. The symbols etched into its surface were rearranging themselves, forming new patterns that spoke of ancient warnings and forgotten prophecies. "It's responding to the cannon's presence," he explained. "The old craft recognizes its corrupted child." His voice hardened, "and rejects it." Jenkins, still weak from his earlier judgment but now bound and guarded by Cain, laughed hoarsely. "You don't even know what that cannon is capable of, do you? What does it really mean?" His burned hands trembled with excitement. "It's not just a weapon, it's evolution. The next step in the craft you were too afraid to take." "Evolution," Solomon's voice cracked like a whip. "You think twisting the natural order is evolution. You think unmaking reality itself is progress." He strode to where Jenkins sat. "Let me show you what true mastery of the craft means." He pressed his hand against the wall of his workshop, and suddenly the wood grain began to shift and flow, revealing the true nature of the material beneath its everyday appearance. The dead wood momentarily returned to life, sap running through. Its grain leaves trying to sprout from its surface. "That's mastery," Solomon said quietly. Not destroying what is, but revealing what could be, helping things become their truest selves. He released the wall and the wood settled back to normal, though now it seemed somehow more real, more present than before. Jenkins stared at the wall in shock. How did you? Because I learned the whole craft, not just the parts about power and destruction. I learned its heart, its purpose. Solomon turned back to the approaching train, its whistle now sounding like the scream of reality, tearing itself apart. And that's why I have to stop what's coming, because it's not just wrong. It's an offense against creation itself. Elena had been studying the strange bullet Solomon had forged earlier. These symbols, she said suddenly, they're not just decorative, are they? They're words, old words. Solomon nodded. The language of creation itself, some say. The words the first smiths used when they taught mankind to shape metal. He checked his master gun again. And when this bullet strikes that cannon, those words will unmake not just the weapon, but the very knowledge that created it. But sir, Miguel spoke up, if it unmakes that knowledge, what about all the good things that knowledge could do, the ways it could help people? Some prices have to be paid, boy, Solomon replied grimly. Some doors need to stay closed. He placed a hand on Miguel's shoulder. Remember what I taught you about honest ironwork, about creating things that help rather than harm. That knowledge, the true heart of the craft, that will survive. The rest, he shook his head, the rest should never have been rediscovered. The train's approach had turned the night into something from a fever dream. Reality rippled and buckled around them. Buildings momentarily became their own blueprints, then solid again. People's reflections in windows began to move independently, sometimes showing possible futures, sometimes showing paths not taken. Captain Harrison's cavalry troops struggled to maintain their positions as their horses fought against rains that kept changing from leather to smoke and back again. The men's uniforms shifted between different eras, sometimes Civil War blue, sometimes Spanish colonial armor, sometimes designs that hadn't been invented yet. Solomon, Sister Maria called out urgently, the angels in the cemetery, they're moving. They turned to see the metal statues Solomon had crafted years ago, shifting on their pedestals, their wings unfurling as if awakening from long sleep. The blessed metal from which they'd been forged was responding to the chaos around them, trying to maintain order in their own way. Good, Solomon said softly. They remember their purpose too. They'll help anchor reality around the church. Keep our people safe. Kane, who had been positioning his deputies around the town, returned with troubling news. Hawkins escaped in the confusion, and he's not the only one. Something's happening to the prisoners. They're changing. Solomon's expression darkened. The cannon's influence. It's not just affecting physical reality, it's changing possibilities, showing people versions of themselves that could have been. He checked his ammunition one final time. And some men, when faced with other possibilities, choose the worst ones. The train was visible now, its form constantly shifting between different possible versions of itself. Steam engine became diesel and became something that ran on principles not yet discovered. And behind it all, reality itself seemed to be trying to escape, to run away from what was mounted on the last car. My God, Harrison breathed, using his binoculars. The cannon, it's not always there. Sometimes I see it, sometimes I see through it, to what might have been there instead. Don't look at it directly, Solomon warned. Its nature is infectious. The more you try to understand it, the more it changes you to match its chaos. Elena gripped Solomon's arm suddenly. The children in the church, I can hear them singing, but it's not just them. It's all possible versions of them, all singing, different songs at once. Indeed, the hymn from the church seemed to layer upon itself, creating harmonies that spoke of paths not taken, choices not made, futures that might still be. The sound provided a strange counterpoint to the reality-warping approach of the train. Solomon raised his master gun, its metal now glowing with a light that seemed to stabilize the air around it. The weapon had been created to serve justice, and now it faced its greatest test, bringing judgment not just to men, but to knowledge itself. "Remember," he told those around him, "whatever happens next, whatever you see, focus on what you know to be real, on who you really are. The cannon doesn't just change physical reality, it changes memory, identity, possibility itself. Don't let it make you forget who you are." The train screamed into the station, its wheels somehow running on tracks that existed in multiple states at once. And mounted on the last car, surrounded by an aura of wrong geometry and impossible colors, stood the cannon that should never have been made. Reality held its breath, waiting to see what would happen when ancient craft met corrupted science, when justice faced chaos, when the power to make met the power to unmake. Solomon Reed stepped forward, his master gun ready, about to wage a battle not just for lives or land, but for the very nature of what was real and what was possible. The train shuddered to a stop, steam hissing from its stack in patterns that wrote impossible equations in the air. The cannon mounted on the last car seemed to exist in multiple places at once, its barrel pointing in several directions simultaneously, while its surface shifted between different metals and materials that had never existed. Standing beside it were figures that had once been men, the military scientists who had created it. But their exposure to the weapon had changed them. They moved like marionettes, controlled by strings of probability, their faces constantly shifting between different possible versions of themselves. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Jenkins called out from where he was restrained. "The perfect marriage of science and craft, the power to rewrite reality itself." Solomon raised his master gun, its blessed metal glowing with purpose. "There's nothing beautiful about corruption, Jenkins, about twisting things from their true nature." The weapon hummed in his hands, recognizing the wrongness it faced. "This ends tonight." The lead scientist, or what remained of him, stepped forward. His voice echoed strangely, as if speaking from multiple timelines at once. "Mr. Reed, we wondered if you'd come. Your reputation precedes you across several possibilities. Then you know why I'm here. To stop progress?" The scientist's face rippled, showing different ages, different choices. "This weapon represents the future, the ability to not just destroy our enemies, but to ensure they never existed in the first place." "That's not progress," Solomon replied firmly. "That's perversion. You've taken sacred craft and twisted it into something that offends creation itself." As if in response to his words, reality buckled around them. The ground rippled like water, buildings briefly turned inside out, and the sky showed multiple versions of itself, day and night existing simultaneously. Eleanor, standing in the workshop doorway, suddenly gasped, "Mr. Reed, the forge, it's responding." Solomon's special forge had begun to pulse with a deep, resonant light. The symbols etched into its surface were rearranging themselves, forming patterns that spoke of judgment and restoration. The metal within it, the reclaimed essence of his corrupted weapons, began to sing a note that made the very air vibrate with purpose. The scientists noticed it too. Their ever-changing faces showed something close to fear. "The old ways," one of them muttered in multiple voices, "still so strong." "Last chance," Solomon called out. "Power down the cannon. Let us destroy it properly. Or what happens next will be on your heads." Their response was to begin rotating the cannon's barrel, or rather all possible versions of its barrel, toward the town. The air around it began to warp and twist, reality trying to escape what was about to happen. Solomon didn't hesitate. His master gun spoke once, the sound like a bell announcing judgment. The bullet, carrying all his knowledge, all his craft, streaked toward the cannon-trailing light that somehow made the world more real around it. But one of the scientists touched the cannon's housing, and suddenly the bullet was traveling through a space where distance had become meaningless. "You don't understand," the lead scientist said, his voice echoing across possibilities. "We've moved beyond simple cause and effect. Your weapons may be magical, Mr. Reed, but ours transcends magic itself." The cannon fired. The shot wasn't physical. It was conceptual, a burst of pure possibility that began unwriting the reality it touched. Where it struck the ground, matter became uncertain, cycling through different states of existence. But Solomon was ready. His master gun fired again, not at the cannon this time, but at the transformed Earth. Where his bullet struck, reality snapped back into focus, forced to remember what it truly was. "Miguel," he shouted, "the forge, now!" His apprentice understood. Racing to the special forge, Miguel began feeding it the materials Solomon had prepared. Metals blessed with purpose, minerals that remembered their true nature. The forge's light intensified, pushing back against the chaos the cannon was creating. Sister Maria began to pray, not in Latin or Spanish, but in words that sounded like metal being forged, like the first hammers striking the first anvils. The angel statues in the cemetery spread their wings wider, their blessed metal helping to anchor reality around the church. The scientists fired the cannon again and again. Each shot created a wave of possibility that threatened to unmake everything it touched. But Solomon's gun answered each time, its bullets carrying the weight of true craft, of metal worked with purpose and blessing. "The forge!" Elena cried out. "It's reaching a critical temperature." Solomon nodded grimly. This was what he'd planned for. "Captain Harrison, get your men clear. What's about to happen? It won't follow any rules of warfare, you know." The special forge had begun to pulse with a light that made the cannon's reality-warping effects seem pale in comparison. The metal within it had reached a state that transcended normal physics, becoming something that existed not just in reality, but in the space where reality was forged. Jenkins, watching from his restraints, began to laugh hysterically. "You can't! You'll destroy everything we've learned, all the power we've gained." "Some power isn't meant for men to have," Solomon replied. He turned to Elena. "Get everyone into the church. The angels will protect you, and Eleanor," he met her eyes, "if this works, I won't be the same. The knowledge, the craft, it'll all be gone." She gripped his hand fiercely. "Then we'll start over, build something new, something better." Solomon smiled, then turned back to face the cannon. Its barrel was spinning through multiple dimensions now, preparing to fire a shot that would unwrite not just the town, but the very possibility of its existence. "Miguel," he called out, "the words I taught you, speak to them now." As Miguel began to recite the ancient smith's blessings, Solomon raised his master gun one final time, but instead of aiming at the cannon, he aimed at his own forge. The scientists realized too late what he was attempting. "No, you'll create a resonance cascade. Reality itself will." Solomon pulled the trigger. The bullet struck the forge just as it reached transcendent heat. There was a sound, like every bell in creation ringing at once, like the first hammer striking the first anvil, like the voice of metal remembering what it was meant to be. The forge exploded, not with fire or shrapnel, but with pure purpose. A wave of reality-affirming power that met the cannon's chaos head-on. When they clashed, possibility itself seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, every version of reality was visible at once. They saw the town as it was, as it had been, as it might have been. They saw themselves in all their possible forms. They saw truth and lies, creation and destruction, all balanced on a knife's edge of probability. Then Solomon's forge light won. The Wave of purpose swept over everything, forcing reality to remember itself. The cannon's metal screamed as it was unmade, not just destroyed but erased from possibility itself. The scientists' multiple forms collapsed into single human shapes, men who would have to live with what they'd attempted. But the cost was high. As the light faded, Solomon felt the knowledge leaving him. Not just the formulas and techniques, but the deep understanding that had made him a master of his craft. The sacred words became just words, the blessing patterns just decorative marks. The price of unmaking chaos was the loss of his own power. Yet as he watched his special forge cool into ordinary metal, as his master gun became just a finely crafted weapon, Solomon Reed felt not loss but relief. Some knowledge was too heavy to carry, some power too great to wield. Captain Harrison approached cautiously, staring at the place where the cannon had been. There was nothing left, not even a memory of its shape in the air. "What happened?" the young officer asked. "What did you do?" Solomon holstered his now ordinary gun. "Reminded the world what it really is. Sometimes that's enough." He turned to Miguel, who was watching the forge's light fade. "Come on, boy. Time to learn honest ironwork, the kind that builds things up instead of tearing them down." As dawn began to paint the canyon walls, the town of Copper Canyon found itself firmly rooted in a single solid reality. The angel statues settled back onto their pedestals, their wings folding around memories that would soon fade like morning mist. And in his workshop, Solomon Reed prepared to teach his apprentice the simpler but no less valuable craft of working metal with skill and care, knowing that sometimes the greatest power lies not in what you can do, but in what you choose not to do. But the aftermath of the confrontation brought its own challenges. As reality settled back into its proper shape, the consequences of what had occurred began to ripple through Copper Canyon. The military scientists, now fully human again, sat in Sheriff Kane's jail, their faces haunted by the memory of what they'd almost unleashed. Their bodies remembered being multiple possibilities at once, and the adjustment back to singular existence left them shaking with withdrawal. "You don't understand what you've done," one of them told Solomon through the cell bars. "That knowledge, that power, it could have revolutionized everything, changed the course of human history." "Some revolutions come at too high a price," Solomon replied, noting how his hands no longer tingled with power when he touched metal. "Some changes aren't worth the cost." Elena found him later in his workshop, sorting through the remains of his special forge. The mysterious symbols had faded from its surface, leaving only ordinary metal behind. The specialized tools he'd used now looked like any other blacksmith's implements. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "Giving up all that knowledge?" Solomon ran his fingers over the forge's now mundane surface. "Knowledge isn't lost, Elena. It's just waiting to be rediscovered when the time is right. When people are ready for it." He picked up a simple hammer. "Besides, there's wisdom in ordinary things too, in honest work and clean metal." Miguel appeared in the doorway, carrying newly made horseshoes, his first solo project since the events of the night before. "Mr. Reed, these came out wrong, didn't they?" He held up the shoes, which were slightly uneven but showed promise. Solomon examined them with new eyes, not the eyes of a master of mystical craft, but those of a skilled tradesman. "No, boy, they came out exactly as they should have, made by human hands, with human skill. That's a different kind of magic altogether." Sister Maria visited later that day, bringing news from the church. "The angel statues have stopped moving," she reported. "They're just metal now, beautiful metal, but—" She touched the cross at her neck. "The blessing in them has gone quiet, as it should," Solomon nodded. "The time for such things has passed, at least for now." He gestured to the cooling horseshoes. "But look there, see how the metal takes its shape? How does it become what It needs to be not through supernatural power, but through skill and patience. There's beauty in that, too. Captain Harrison had remained in town with a small detachment, overseeing the removal of what little physical evidence remained of the reality-warping cannon. He found Solomon at his workbench that evening. "My superiors won't believe the official report," he said without preamble, "about what really happened here." "Probably for the best," Solomon replied, working on a simple plough blade. "Some things are better left to legend and rumor. But the scientists—" Harrison hesitated. "They remember everything, multiple versions of everything." Solomon's hands stilled on his work. "They remember possibilities, Captain. But possibilities aren't the same as realities. In time, those memories will fade. They'll become like dreams, things that might have been but never were." Jenkins, still in custody but recovering from his burns, had become strangely peaceful. When Solomon visited him, the former apprentice was tracing patterns in the dust of his cell floor, but ordinary patterns now, without power or purpose. "I understand now," Jenkins said quietly, "what you tried to teach me all those years ago, about the difference between knowing how to do something and knowing whether you should." He looked up at his former master. "The craft, it wasn't about power at all, was it?" "No," Solomon agreed. "It was about responsibility, about understanding that just because you can shape reality doesn't mean you should." He studied with his former student. "Maybe now you're ready to learn the real craft, the everyday magic of making things that help rather than harm." As evening approached, Solomon stood in his workshop doorway, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls. The light was just light now, not multiple possibilities of illumination. The shadows were simply shadows, not doorways to what might have been. Elena joined him, her hand finding his. "The children want to know if you'll still make toys for Christmas, even without the special metal." Solomon smiled, feeling the weight of ordinary tools at his belt, tools that could still create wonders, just slower, simpler ones. "Reckon I will. Might not be able to make dolls that dance on their own anymore, or toy soldiers that march in formation." He patted his hammer. "But sometimes the best gifts are the ones made with nothing but skill and care. And love," Elena added softly. "And love," he agreed. "The most ordinary magic of all, and maybe the most powerful." Inside his workshop, the forge burned with natural fire, ready for another day of honest work. The master gun, now just a finely crafted weapon, hung on the wall, a reminder of what had been and what had been given up. But as Solomon Reed prepared for a simpler life of working metal with mundane skill rather than supernatural craft, he felt no regret, for in choosing to unmake the power that could have reshaped reality, he had preserved something far more precious: the right of every soul to forge its own destiny, one choice at a time. A month passed, and autumn painted copper canyon in shades of gold and crimson. The events of that strange night had begun to fade from most people's memories, becoming more like a shared dream than reality. But subtle changes remained, visible to those who knew where to look. The military scientists had been quietly transferred to a facility back east, their ramblings about multiple realities and possible weapons dismissed as trauma-induced delusions. All except one, the youngest of them, Dr. James Morrison, who had asked to stay in Copper Canyon. "I need to understand," he told Solomon one morning, watching the blacksmith work ordinary metal with extraordinary skill. "Not the power we lost, but the wisdom we never had." Solomon studied the young scientist as he shaped a horseshoe with practiced strikes. "Wisdom usually starts with simple things," he replied, holding up the glowing metal, "like understanding that true strength isn't in how much you can change something, but in knowing when to let it be what it is." Morrison had taken to spending. His mornings at the forge, not trying to relearn the lost supernatural craft, but studying the everyday magic of skillful metalwork. His scientific mind found new fascination in the ordinary physics of metallurgy, in the way different alloys behaved under heat and pressure. Elena's school had changed too. The children who had been present during the reality warping incident retained a certain sensitivity to possibility. They saw patterns others missed, understood connections that weren't obvious. She had adapted her teaching to help them channel this awareness into creativity rather than chaos. "They're different now," she told Solomon during one of their evening conversations. "Not in any way you could measure or prove, but..." She gestured to where her students were performing a new play, one they had written themselves about a town where magic hid in ordinary things. "They understand something most adults forget," Solomon nodded, "that wonder doesn't need supernatural power to exist. It's in the way metal flows, in how stories shape themselves, in the patterns that connect all things." Miguel's training had taken an interesting turn. Without access to supernatural craft, he had developed an almost uncanny intuition for metal's natural properties. His work showed a precision that went beyond mere technical skill, a deep understanding of how materials wanted to behave. "The metal still speaks," he explained to Dr. Morrison one day, working on a complex repair. "Not with magic anymore, but with its own voice. You just have to learn to listen differently." Sheriff Kane had his own adjustments to make. The jail cells that had briefly held reality-warped prisoners now housed ordinary criminals, but something about the space had changed. Inmates reported strange dreams, moments of startling clarity about their lives and choices. "It's like the walls remember," Kane told Solomon. "Not the chaos from that night, but the return to order. Makes people think about their own need to set things right." Jenkins, still recovering from his burns but no longer a prisoner, had begun helping Sister Maria restore the church's metalwork. His hands, once burned by corrupted power, now found healing in crafting simple but beautiful things: candle holders, altar rails, frames for sacred images. "Each piece is a kind of penance," he explained to Solomon when his former master came to inspect the work. "Not trying to grasp power anymore, just trying to add some beauty to the world, to make up for what I almost helped destroy." But not all changes were peaceful. Word had spread about Copper Canyon's blacksmith, distorted. Tales of the confrontation with the reality-warping cannon. Other gunsmiths and metalworkers began arriving, drawn by rumors of lost knowledge and hidden power. One morning, Solomon found a man waiting at his forge, a wealthy industrialist named Victor Brunswick, who had made his fortune manufacturing weapons back east. "I know what happened here," Brunswick declared without preamble. "Not the sanitized military report or the local legends. I know about the craft, Mr. Reed, and I believe some fragments of that knowledge must remain." Solomon continued his work, carefully shaping a piece of ordinary iron. "Believe what you want, Mr. Brunswick. Knowledge that's meant to survive, survives in its own way, in its own time." "I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer," Brunswick pressed, "for any remnants of your special techniques. Even incomplete knowledge would be invaluable." Solomon set down his hammer and faced the industrialist. "Let me show you something." He led Brunswick to the back of his shop, where rows of finished pieces stood on display: plowshares, cooking pots, builder's tools, and children's toys. "See? These," Solomon gestured to the items, "made with skill, patience, and understanding of the metal's nature. No supernatural craft, no reality-warping power, just honest work that helps people live better lives." He picked up a small metal horse he'd made for one of Eleanor's students. "Tell me, Mr. Brunswick, which is more valuable? Power that can unmake reality, or skill that can bring joy to a child?" Brunswick scoffed. "Noble sentiments, Mr. Reed. But we both know there's more to it. The military scientists, their minds were affected by exposure to possibilities that shouldn't exist. Surely some echo of that knowledge exists only as a reminder, Solomon interrupted firmly. Why do some doors remain closed? He returned to his forge. Now, if you're interested in learning actual metalwork, I'm always willing to teach, but if you're hunting for power that's better left forgotten, you're wasting both our time. Yet even as he dismissed Brunswick, Solomon noticed something interesting. The industrialist's pocket watch chain, a seemingly ordinary piece of metalwork, had begun to tarnish in an unusual pattern. The discoloration formed shapes that looked almost like the blessing symbols that had once adorned Solomon's special forge. Strange, Solomon mused after Brunswick had left. Maybe some knowledge does survive, but not in ways we expect, not in ways that can be bought or sold or used for power. He touched his hammer thoughtfully. Maybe it survives in the metal itself, waiting for the right time, the right hands, the right purpose. That evening, as Solomon taught Miguel the intricacies of tempering steel, he reflected on how the craft had changed without really ending. The supernatural power was gone, but the deeper magic, the everyday miracle of taking raw metal and shaping it into something useful and beautiful, remained as strong as ever, and perhaps that had been the true lesson all along. Not that power must be destroyed to prevent its misuse, but that the greatest powers often hide in the simplest things, in skilled hands shaping honest materials, in wisdom passed from master to apprentice, in the quiet satisfaction of work well done. The sun set over Copper Canyon, painting the workshop in shades of gold and shadow. Elena's children could be heard in the distance, singing songs about possibilities and choices. Sister Maria's restored church bells rang with pure, clean tones that seemed to make the air itself more real. And Solomon Reed, no longer a master of supernatural craft, but still a master of his trade, prepared to teach his apprentice the most important lesson of all, that true magic isn't in bending reality to your will, but in helping reality become more fully what it already is. The following days brought more visitors like Brunswick, men of wealth and ambition who'd caught wind of the strange tales spreading from Copper Canyon. Each came with offers more generous than the last, each left disappointed but oddly changed by their encounters with the humble blacksmith. Dr. Morrison noticed it first. "Their watches," he said one evening, watching another frustrated industrialist leave the shop. "Every time they come here, their timepieces start behaving strangely, not stopping or running fast, but—" he struggled to find the right words. "It's like they're keeping time with something deeper than minutes and hours." Solomon examined a pocket watch that a particularly insistent visitor had left behind as a bribe. The golden case had begun developing patterns that shouldn't have been possible, subtle spirals and curves that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. "The metal remembers," he said quietly. "Not the power we unmade, but something old, something that was there all along, before we learned to twist it with supernatural craft." He handed the watch to Miguel. "What do you feel?" The apprentice held it carefully, his fingers tracing the emerging patterns. "It's like it's trying to tell a story, not with words or pictures, but with its own nature." His eyes widened. "Is this what you meant about metal having its own voice?" "Partly," Solomon nodded, "but there's more. Dr. Morrison, what does your scientific mind make of these patterns?" The young scientist adjusted his spectacles, studying the watch closely. "They're not random. There's a mathematical precision to them, but it's not any geometry I've studied." He pulled out a notebook, sketching rapidly. "Look here. The curves follow the same ratios we see in natural growth patterns, shell spirals, leaf arrangements, the way crystals form." "The language of creation itself," Sister Maria said from the doorway. She'd come to discuss the church's new bell tower, but found herself drawn into the conversation. Not the words of power you used to use, Mr. Reed, but the grammar that underlies all things. Elena, who had been grading papers at her usual corner of the workshop, looked up thoughtfully. Is that why my students' drawings have changed? They're not just pictures anymore. They're full of patterns that seem to mean something, even if we can't quite read them. Solomon picked up his hammer, studying its worn handle. When we unmade the reality-warping power, we didn't destroy the underlying truth it had twisted. We just let it return to its natural state. He smiled at Miguel's confused expression. Like working metal, you can forge it into a weapon that defies nature, or you can help it become what it was always meant to be. Jenkins, who had taken to visiting in the evenings to discuss his work at the church, added his own observation. The altar rails we've been crafting, people say they feel different when they touch them. Not supernatural, just real. More real than ordinary metal. Because you're working with the metal's nature now, not against it, Solomon explained, understanding it instead of trying to dominate it. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Kane, looking troubled. Got word from the territorial marshal, he announced. Brunswick isn't just a wealthy industrialist. He's been buying up every old forge and foundry he can find, especially ones with unusual histories, looking for traces of the old craft, Solomon mused, but finding something else instead. He described the strange behavior of the pocket watches. Kane nodded grimly. That's not all. The marshal says wherever Brunswick sets up his operations, strange things start happening. Not reality-warping chaos like before, but changes, metal objects developing unusual patterns, tools that work better than they should, machines that seem to run on more than just steam and gears. Dr. Morrison leaned forward eagerly. A natural phenomenon emerging to fill the void left by the supernatural craft. Fascinating. We could study it, document it, or, Solomon interrupted firmly, we could let it be what it is. Some things need to grow in their own time, their own way. He turned to Kane. Still, keep an eye on Brunswick. Men like him, they have a way of trying to force nature's hand. The sheriff departed, leaving them to ponder this new development. Elena's students could be heard in the schoolyard, their games now incorporating complex patterns that seemed to mirror the ones appearing in metal across the town. Mr. Reed, Miguel asked suddenly, if the supernatural craft is gone, but the metal still remembers, what are we really learning here? Solomon picked up a piece of raw iron, holding it so his apprentice could see how the light played across its surface. We're learning to listen, boy, not to words of power or blessing patterns, but to the metal itself, to understand what it wants to become, not what we want to force it to be. Like the way you knew that cavalry saber needed more carbon in the steel, Dr. Morrison interjected. Not from any formula or supernatural insight, but from... He waved his hands, searching for the right words. From paying attention, Solomon finished. From respecting the materials and the craft enough to let them teach you their nature. He began heating the iron in his forge, his ordinary forge now, but somehow no less magical for its simplicity. As the metal began to glow, they all saw it patterns in the heat, in the way the metal took the fire, in how it responded to Solomon's skilled hands. Not supernatural manifestations, but the subtle language of the craft itself, speaking to those who had learned to listen. Sister Maria crossed herself, but her expression was one of wonder rather than fear. Perhaps this is how it was always meant to be. Not power that breaks the world's laws, but wisdom that helps us understand them better. The evening deepened around them, and in Solomon Reed's workshop, a new kind of craft was taking shape, one built not on supernatural power, but on the deeper magic of skill, understanding, and respect for the true nature of things. And somewhere, in the gathering darkness, Brunswick's pocket watch kept time with rhythms older than human reckoning, its metal remembering truths that no amount of ambition or wealth could ever truly possess. Winter came early to Copper Canyon, bringing with it winds that seemed to whisper secrets in the language of frost and iron. Brunswick's activities had not gone unnoticed. His company had purchased 3 old forges in neighboring towns, each one historically connected to craftsmen who had worked with more than mere metal. One cold morning, Dr. Morrison burst into Solomon's workshop, his scientific composure shattered by excitement. "You need to see this," he declared, spreading out several telegrams on the workbench. "Reports from Brunswick's facilities. They're doing something unprecedented." Solomon studied the messages while Elena and Miguel gathered around. The reports described strange occurrences at Brunswick's newly acquired forges, metal behaving in ways that defied conventional physics, machines operating at impossible efficiencies, workers developing an almost supernatural affinity for their materials. "He's trying to industrialize it," Solomon realized grimly, "taking the natural patterns we've observed and attempting to force them into production." He picked up one of the telegrams. "Mass-producing miracle metal, as if nature's own voice could be captured in an assembly line." "But that's not the worst part," Morrison continued, pulling out a newspaper clipping. "Look at what they're making." The article detailed Brunswick Industries' new line of enhanced products, tools that never seemed too dull, machines that ran without apparent power sources, metals that could heal themselves when damaged, all explained away with vague references to revolutionary metallurgical processes and advanced scientific principles. "He's walking a dangerous line," Solomon muttered, "not twisting reality like the canon did, but still trying to force nature's hand. And nature," he gestured to his own forge, where the day's work waited, "nature has a way of pushing back against such presumption." As if to emphasize his point, a strange sound began emanating from Brunswick's pocket watch, which Solomon had kept for study. The timepiece had developed new patterns, but now they seemed agitated, distressed. The hands spun wildly, not just around the dial, but in impossible directions, as if trying to warn of something approaching. Elena's students had noticed changes too. Their drawings had become increasingly complex, filled with patterns that seemed to predict events before they happened. One child had sketched what looked like a factory consumed by living metal, the lines of the drawing writhing on the page like snakes of ink. "There's more," Sheriff Kane announced, entering the workshop with fresh telegrams. "Brunswick's workers. Some of them are changing. Not like the reality warping from before, but—" He struggled to find the right words. "It's like the metal is teaching them things they weren't ready to learn." Jenkins, who had been quietly working on a new church bell, spoke up. "Like what happened to me when I stole knowledge I wasn't prepared for. But this is different. It's not chaos trying to break free, it's—" He held up his hands, still bearing the scars of his judgment. "It's an order trying to maintain itself." Solomon nodded slowly. The old craft wasn't just about power, it was about responsibility, about understanding your place in the natural order of things. Try to force that order, try to bend it to human greed. He let the thought hang ominously. "Doctor." Morrison's scientific mind was racing with possibilities. "But surely if we could study it, understand the principles at work—" "That's exactly the kind of thinking that created the reality-warping canon," Solomon interrupted firmly. "Some things aren't meant to be studied and replicated. They're meant to be experienced, understood, respected." Sister Maria entered, carrying news from her contacts in other parishes. "The effects are spreading," she reported. "Every forge Brunswick buys, every factory he converts, they become nexus points for these changes. The metal remembers more strongly there, speaks more loudly. And not always kindly," Jenkins added. "I've heard stories of machines turning on their operators, of molten metal flowing against gravity, of factories where the laws of nature simply stop working." Solomon picked up his hammer, a simple tool that had never been enhanced by supernatural craft, but had shaped metal true for decades. Because Brunswick and his kind don't understand. They see the patterns emerging in the metal, the way it remembers, its true nature, and they think it's just another resource to be exploited. But it's fighting back, Miguel said suddenly, understanding dawning in his young face. Not with chaos like before, but with truth, showing us what happens when you try to cage nature's voice in machines. A commotion outside drew their attention. One of Brunswick's men had arrived, not a businessman this time, but a worker from his nearest facility. The man's clothes were stained with metallic residue that seemed to move of its own accord, and his eyes held a haunted look. "Mr. Reed," he gasped, clutching the workshop's doorframe. "You have to help us. The metal, it's awakening. Not like you said it would, not. Natural and slow, but—" He held out his hands, which had developed a metallic sheen. Brunswick pushed too hard, tried to force it, and now— Solomon examined the man's hands carefully. The metal wasn't corrupting him like the reality-warping cannon had corrupted its creators. Instead, it seemed to be teaching him, but too fast, too forcefully, like trying to pour an ocean into a teacup. "How many others?" Solomon asked quietly. "Dozens, and more every day. The machines, they're changing too. Not just working better than they should, but—" The worker shuddered. "They're starting to work together, to purpose, like they're building something we don't understand." Dr. Morrison was frantically taking notes, but Elena noticed something odd about his paper. The ink was arranging itself into familiar patterns, the same ones they'd seen in the metal. The natural world was speaking through every medium it could. "A find trying to warn them. We have to stop him," Kane declared. "Brunswick's factories are already stopping themselves," Solomon interrupted, holding up Brunswick's pocket watch. Its hands had aligned into a pattern that pointed directly at the largest nearby facility. "The question is whether they'll stop cleanly, or take half the territory with them when nature finally loses patience." Sister Maria clutched her rosary, which had begun developing the same swirling pattern seen in the metal. "What can we do?" Solomon turned to his forge, his simple, honest forge that had never tried to be more than it was. "We remind the metal of its true nature, not with supernatural craft or industrial greed, but with understanding, with respect." He began heating iron, his movements precise and reverent. "We show that some of us still remember the right way to work with nature's voice." The winter wind howled outside, carrying the sound of distant factories where metal was awakening to its own power, its own purpose. And in his workshop, Solomon Reed prepared to teach one final lesson about the difference between mastering nature and working in harmony with it. The dawn broke over Copper Canyon, with a light that seemed to reflect off every metal surface in town, each piece singing in its own quiet way. Solomon Reed stood at his forge, watching the sunrise paint the world in shades of copper and gold, knowing that this day would determine whether mankind's relationship with metal would be one of harmony or catastrophe. Brunswick's largest facility, ironically built in an abandoned silver mine just outside of town, had gone silent overnight. No steam from its chimneys, no sound of machines, just an eerie quiet that spoke of something building, waiting, preparing. "The workers all left," Sheriff Kane reported, his badge now showing intricate patterns that moved like flowing water. "Said the machines stopped taking orders and started organizing themselves." Dr. Morrison's scientific instruments had ceased functioning normally, each one now measuring something beyond their designed purpose. His thermometer showed the temperature of possibilities, his compass pointed toward intentions rather than north, his barometer registered the pressure of accumulated knowledge. It's fascinating, the young scientist breathed, watching his equipment's erratic behavior. The natural patterns we observed, they're not just affecting metal anymore. They're spreading to everything that measures, everything that marks humanity's attempt to quantify the world. Elena's school had been closed, her students' drawings having become too prophetic to ignore. The children gathered at the church instead, where Sister Maria led them in songs that seemed to harmonize with the humming of awakened metal throughout the town. "Mr. Reed," Miguel called from the workshop door. "Someone's coming." Brunswick himself appeared through the morning mist, but he was changed. His fine suit had developed a metallic sheen, his pocket watch chain had wrapped around him like a living thing, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who had seen too much truth too quickly. "You were right," Brunswick said without preamble, his voice resonating strangely. "We pushed too hard, tried to force nature's hand. And now—" He held up his hands, which had begun to develop the same patterns they'd seen in the metal. "Now it's teaching us, whether we want to learn or not." Solomon studied the industrialist carefully. "Not teaching," he corrected, "reminding of what we used to know before we decided to master nature instead of working with it." "The factory," Brunswick continued urgently. "Something's happening. There, the machines, the metal, they're building something. Something that could either save us or destroy us, and I don't think they care which anymore." Jenkins, who had been quietly working on the church bells, spoke up. "Like what happened at Dead Horse Creek, when the twisted craft turned on its users." "No," Solomon said firmly. "This is different. This isn't chaos trying to break free. This is an order trying to restore itself." He picked up his hammer, his simple, honest hammer that had never tried to be more than it was. The metal remembers what it means to be metal. The machines remember what tools are meant to be, and they're trying to remind us. Elena approached, carrying one of her students' drawings. It showed the factory, but not as it was. The picture depicted something more like a massive forge, where metal and machine worked together in harmony with human hands, creating things that were both miraculous and natural. "Is this what they're building?" she asked quietly. "A new way of working with metal? Or maybe an old way," Solomon mused. "The way it was always meant to be, before we started forcing our will upon it." Dr. Morrison's instruments had all aligned to point at the factory. "Whatever's happening there, it's reaching some kind of crescendo. The patterns, the changes, they're all converging." Solomon nodded grimly. "Then it's time." He turned to Brunswick. "You wanted to understand the craft's secrets? Here's the most important one. True craft isn't about mastery. It's about partnership, about listening to what the materials tell you they want to become." "And what does the metal want now?" Brunswick asked, his watch chain thrumming with accumulated knowledge. "To teach us that lesson once and for all." Solomon began gathering specific tools, not the supernatural implements of his past, but honest tools that had shaped metal true for decades. "Miguel, stoke the forge. Elena, bring your students' drawings. Dr. Morrison, your measurements might be useful. The rest of you—" He looked at the gathered townspeople. "Pray that we're ready to learn what the metal's been trying to teach us." They made their way to Brunswick's factory, where the morning light revealed something extraordinary. The building had transformed. Its rigid industrial lines had softened into organic curves. The machines inside had rearranged themselves into patterns that spoke of natural growth and harmony. Metal flowed like water, but not in chaos, in perfect, purposeful order. "It's beautiful," Miguel whispered, watching sheets of steel fold themselves like paper, forming structures that seemed both industrial and alive. "It's what happens when we stop forcing and start listening," Solomon replied. He approached the factory's entrance, where molten metal had formed patterns similar to those on his old forge. "Metal doesn't need our supernatural craft or our industrial ambitions. It just needs us to understand its nature, to work with it, rather than trying to dominate it. Brunswick stepped forward, his metallic suit now fully part of him. Then what do we do? How do we make this right? Solomon held up his hammer. We do what true craftsmen have always done. We listen. We learn. We work with the material's nature, not against it. He turned to the others. Elena, have your students sing their songs. The metal responds to harmony. Dr. Morrison, record everything you see, but remember that understanding doesn't mean controlling. Sister Maria, your prayers might help. The metal remembers the blessing, even if it's not the kind I used to use. As they followed his instructions, the factory began to pulse with inner light. The machines, the metal, the very structure of the building, all of it moved in perfect synchronization, like a vast heart beating with possibility. It's not destroying itself, Dr. Morrison realized, watching his instruments dance with new purpose. It's transforming, showing us how technology and nature can work together. Solomon nodded, stepping into the transformed factory. This is what the craft was always meant to be. Not supernatural power, not industrial might, but understanding, partnership, respect for the true nature of things. The metal responded to his presence, not with the old supernatural resonance, but with something deeper. The patterns that had emerged in watches and tools across the territory began to stabilize, no longer wild with forced purpose, but steady with natural truth. Brunswick watched in wonder as his factory transformed into something new, not an industrial monster forcing nature's hand, but a place where human skill and natural law worked in harmony. His own metallic changes began to settle, becoming less a corruption and more an understanding written in flesh and steel. I think, he said slowly, I finally understand what you've been trying to teach us. Solomon smiled, watching as the factory's machines settled into new configurations, ready to work with human hands rather than replace them. The real miracle was never in supernatural craft or industrial power. It was in the simple truth that metal, like all of nature, knows what it wants to be. Our job isn't to force it, but to help it become its truest self. As the sun climbed higher, Copper Canyon witnessed the birth of something new, or perhaps the rebirth of something very old. A way of working with metal that honored both human skill and natural law, that created wonders without forcing them, that remembered the difference between mastery and partnership. And in his workshop that evening, Solomon Reed began teaching his apprentice the first lesson all over again. Not how to bend metal to human will, but how to listen to what the metal was trying to teach humanity all along. The age of supernatural craft had ended with the reality warping cannon. The age of industrial domination had ended in Brunswick's transformed factory. But the age of true partnership with nature's own craft was just beginning. And that, perhaps, was the greatest wonder of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.